Hi, you're listening to Photography and Walking, a podcast about moving through the world with a camera and a question. Each episode begins with an image and follows its path, through memory, through cities, through time. This isn't about answers, it's about encounters. So, what does it mean to walk through a city with intention? Not just to get somewhere, but to make the walk itself the point. Today, we're heading back to Montreal to 1970. That year, artist Françoise Sullivan stepped out of one museum and walked to another. And that simple act, walking from point A to point B, became a work of art. If you've listened to earlier episodes, you've probably noticed a theme. Walking and photography often overlap in quiet, surprising ways. Sometimes it's a street scene that catches your eye mid-stride. Other times, it's the walk itself that becomes the artwork. That's what we're diving into today. By 1970, walking had become a medium in contemporary art. In London, artists like Hamish Fulton and Richard Long called their walks art. No paint, no sculpture, just movement, time, and often a camera. In Montreal, Bill Vazan walked St. Catherine Street, snapping a photo at each intersection. Sullivan's walk? It was something else. Her gesture wasn't about just the walk, mapping a city or creating a pattern. It was personal, bounded, quietly radical. On a day in 1970, she walked from the Musée d'Art Contemporain in Montréal, then located out on Cité du Havre, all the way to the Musée des Beaux-Arts, up on Sherbrooke Street. Two very different spaces. And by choosing that route, Sullivan wasn't just changing locations. She was moving between artistic worlds, institutional powers, and ways of seeing. Let's pause on Cité du Havre for a moment. If you're not from Montreal, this spot might not ring a bell. But it's a fascinating place, a man-made land built for Expo 67. The MAC had been installed there the year after the Expo. In contrast, the Musée des Beaux-Arts, more traditional and rooted in historical collections, sat comfortably in the city's upper crust. When Françoise Sullivan walked from one to the other, she was doing more than crossing space. She was stitching together two visions of culture. She was also marking her own position, stepping through a city that hadn't always left room for women artists. And the thing is, there was no film crew, just Françoise Sullivan, walking, a portable camera in hand. But this wasn't ephemeral. She documented it. When I met with her to discuss the piece, she recounted. I decided to walk from the Museum of Fine Art to the Museum of Contemporary Art and back to see what was in between. I would take my camera, an ordinary camera, and I would take a photo at each street corner without making any aesthetic choices. I'd take a photograph of exactly what was there at that moment, and then I'd continue on like that. The project was rooted in conceptual art, but it still exists today through the snapshots she took along her walk. We now tend to associate walking with names like Fulton, Long, or conceptual heavyweights like Vito Acconci or Sophie Calle. But Sullivan's work predates or parallels many of these, and adds a distinctly Montreal layer to the story. Hers was not a romantic stroll, nor a macho endurance test. It was a woman moving through institutional space, using her steps and the street as her medium. And if you think about it, there's something deeply political in that. This was 1970. Montreal was changing. The year of Sullivan's walk, the October crisis would erupt. There was a tension in the air about language, about power, about identity. And in the art world, too, questions were brewing. Who gets to define what art is? Who gets to be seen? Now, Sullivan was already a respected artist, part of the Automatiste group, signer of the Refus Global Manifesto, which had shaken conservative Quebec culture a few decades earlier. But this wasn't about repeating her past. It was about moving forward, literally and artistically. While her walk between museums wasn't staged for an audience, Françoise Sullivan did photograph her amble, not as artful compositions, but as a record of what was there. The walk becomes a sequence, a route, a frame-by-frame experience, unfolding through time and space. The city becomes a kind of contact sheet. Every step is a frame, even if it's never enlarged or displayed. In fact, this episode pairs beautifully with Bill Vazan's intersection photos. His was about external grids, mapping the city, documenting intersections. Sullivan's, on the other hand, was about internal geography, each artist making their own path, one step at a time. And there's also something resonant here with the feminist energy that would soon crest in the 1970s. Sullivan's walk wasn't overtly activist, but it carried a quiet resistance. At a time when women's bodies were often objectified in art, she used her own body as subject and agent, not to be looked at, but to move, to traverse, to decide. And that's part of why this work still matters. Here, I have a confession, and you won't hear this kind of praise often from me. Françoise Sullivan genuinely impresses me. No, she's not a walking artist in the strict sense, nor is she a street photographer. But she has never allowed her identity to be pinned down by any single medium. Her creative life spans 9 decades. Painter, sculptor, dancer, choreographer, photographer. She inhabits all these roles with presence and purpose. Her Danse dans la neige, performed on a snow-covered hill while Maurice Perron photographed her movements, is a landmark in Canadian art history. It united movement, landscape, and lens, long before interdisciplinary became a buzzword. That stamina is hard-won. Imagine navigating the art worlds of the 1950s and 60s as a woman committed to avant-garde practice. The machismo was real, and the exclusion constant. Yet Sullivan persisted, signing the Revue Globale, insisting on her place in the story, and producing work that still defies simplification. And at 103, she is still active, and her longevity isn't just biological. It's intellectual, creative, and moral. There's something deeply moving about that. For Sullivan, the heart of her 1970 walk lies in the concept, not the object. Museums, she once implied, risk becoming static, repositories, while art's true pulse migrates elsewhere, into the street, into the act, into the encounter. In the photographs, the walk unfolds between the Musée d'Art Contemporain towards the Musée des Beaux-Arts. In conversation, Sullivan once mentioned beginning at the Beaux-Arts, perhaps a simple lapse of memory or a reminder that the walk itself mattered more than its direction. In her mosaic, the photo's path begins at the Contemporary Museum and ends at the modern one, a route that might seem backwards in historical terms. In any case, the work as we encounter it today remains a forward walk, street by street. It also gestures towards a reevaluation of institutional time, a refusal to see the past as irrelevant. How we interpret the piece depends on the lens we apply. Choreography, mapping, documentation, chants, all are relevant. But for me, psychogeography remains the richest reading. Not in the textbook sense of dérive or flânerie, but in the more entangled sense of body in terrain, of felt space. Now remember, Sullivan's walk is not observational. It's spatially performative. She's not just passing through the city. She is composing it. Melvin Coverley reminds us that psychogeography resists fixity, that it exists in the tension between intent and accident. Phil Smith goes further. His idea of mythogeography treats every walk as a performed story, a living myth shaped by streets and choices and weather. In this light, Sullivan is not merely the walker, she is the walk's protagonist and its legend. And the camera in her hands is not just a recorder, it's a ritual tool of presence, claiming space at every corner. Her walk also anticipates today's slow mapping practices, a resistance to speed and productivity in favor of embodied movement. It echoes the analog resurgence in photography, where slowing down becomes a form of care. Sullivan's walk, too, is analog. 32 frames, a route between chosen places, the camera always facing forward. This constraint creates a sort of poetics of orientation, repetition, and commitment. You could say there's a quiet defiance in what Sullivan did. Walking from one museum to another might not sound radical, but in 1970, in a car-centric, male-dominated city, a woman undertaking a durational public act with a camera was far from ordinary. Her decision to proceed without apology reads as both aesthetic act and feminist declaration. Today, when artists and thinkers revisit the political act of walking, whether through disability studies, gendered space, or climate mapping, Sullivan's work feels newly relevant. It's not about spectacle, it's about insistence. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. So, next time you walk from one place to another, try asking yourself, what am I really crossing here? What systems? What histories? What institutions? You might find that the sidewalk tells a deeper story than you thought. Until our next episode, thanks for walking this one with me. And if you'd like to see images and more about this episode, you can visit photographyandwalking.com.